Okay, let's think about this. What actually happens when public conversation just stops being a real debate, with nuance, and instead turns into, well, just performance, like this competition of absolute certainty?
Mm.
We are diving into a book today that really tackles this head on. It argues that the very structure of how we talk to each other in America might have been, well, permanently fractured.
Yeah, that's Thomas Chatterton Williams' Summer of Our Discontent, The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse. And it's quite a really compelling, very personal. It sort of weaves together memoir, sharp socio-political commentary, and philosophical thinking, too.
And he focuses really intensely on that period after the summer of 2020, right?
Exactly. The murder of George Floyd, the pandemic lockdowns,
Yeah.
and then this rapid acceleration of identity-focused politics that just seemed to explode.
Now, Williams makes some pretty huge claims in this book, and to really get into them, we don't want to just summarize it. We actually believe that some books, well, they need to be challenged, properly evaluated. So this critique uses, where it makes sense, a step-by-step critical thinking framework. It helps us map his claims to the evidence he presents, judge the quality of his support.
And we also bring in an intellectual framework, kind of looking at the type of argument he's making. Is it verifiable knowledge or maybe more informed opinion? Or is he reaching for a kind of wisdom?
Mm-hmm.
Plus, we use the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble to check for ethical consistency, maybe identify asymmetries, and ensure a balanced civic perspective. Then we wrap up with a logical analysis and hopefully a balanced conclusion.
And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. This is powered by Google's NotebookLM, aimed at providing a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Okay.
So let's jump right in, the core of it all. Williams' big argument about what actually happened after 2020.
Well, his main contention basically is that the events around George Floyd's murder and the pandemic, they triggered what he thinks was the largest protest movement in American history.
The largest, wow.
Yeah. And he argues it was just so significant, so pervasive, that it fundamentally altered things, like our media norms, culture, even the language we use day to day, and definitely how political discourse operates now.
That's fascinating, because he's not just saying this happened. He's diagnosing a fundamental shift in the culture, which I guess leads straight to his idea about polarization. How does he connect those events to our political divides getting so much deeper?
Right. Well, he argues that this really profound and frankly very rapid shift towards what he calls racialized wokeness on the left, it just inevitably created this powerful, almost reactionary backlash from the right.
The feedback loop.
Exactly. He sees it as this destructive cycle, pushing polarization way beyond what we've seen before. And he suggests that, both sides have now kind of adopted this language of absolute certainty. It makes compromise or even just genuine discussion almost impossible.
And he uses some really concrete examples to show this, right? It's not just abstract theory. What are the key areas he points to?
Absolutely. He looks at specific flashpoints, things like the huge debates over policing and reform, the explosion of cancel culture talk, especially within institutions, and those intense fights over critical race theory in schools and elsewhere. And importantly, he tries to give it historical context. He draws parallels to other times of intense unrest, like the late 1960s, or maybe the kind of rigidity that set in after September 11th.
And what makes the book, I think, so readable is that it's not just detached observation. He really weaves his own life into it. That gives him a unique perspective, doesn't it?
Totally. Yeah, he draws heavily on his background having a black father and a white mother, and also his experience living abroad, mostly in France.
Ah, the French connection.
And that's really key, because living there lets him highlight these really contrasting attitudes towards race, secularism, social justice, things that look very different compared to the highly racialized way these topics often dominate in the U.S. That personal angle is powerful evidence in itself, in a way.
So, okay, when we look at the evidence he's marshaling overall, what kind of stuff is it? Is it all just personal stories, or is there broader documentation?
No, it's definitely a mix, which I think is one of its strengths. You see, like real-time documentation of events as they unfolded, detailed examples from online culture campus stuff, social media trends, his own personal anecdotes, obviously, to ground the ideas, but also some pretty in-depth analysis of specific high-profile incidents. Uses things like the Jussie Smollett hoax, for example, to show how public talk got kind of warped by performance and this demand for certainty.
Okay, let's maybe shift gears a bit and start applying our critical framework. We usually start by asking about the type of argument. Is Williams mostly giving us facts here, or is it more his interpretation, his opinion?
Well, a lot of the book is, I'd say, informed opinion. I mean, it has to be, right? It's
Oh.
commentary.
Hmm.
But it's grounded in his personal experience as a known critic and his pretty sharp observations of things we can all see happening, events in the news, shifts in media.
But he does try to anchor that opinion in facts, right?
Yes.
What are the claims that feel like they rise to the level of, documented knowledge?
Yeah, the knowledge claims are things like the documented scale of the 2020 protests is pretty verifiable historical fact. And he makes references to specific visible changes, like in education policy or shifts in media coverage norms. Those are observable.
Okay.
But where his understanding really comes through is in connecting those dots, linking those specific events to these broader, maybe longer-term patterns. He sees like a decline in classical liberal ideas or this rise in ideological certainty. He's building understanding through synthesis, really.
And if that's the knowledge and the understanding, what's the ultimate wisdom he's hoping readers take away? What's the big message?
I think that's the aspirational goal of the book. It's this hope for maybe a genuinely universalist, perhaps even colorblind society eventually, where core liberal values rooted in just basic human dignity for everyone could maybe replace these rigid essentialist identity categories that he clearly believes are driving so much division right now.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's try measuring his critique against something foundational, like the goals in the U.S. Constitution's Preamble. You mentioned Williams is worried about civic unity weakening, and especially about free expression being lost. How does his argument connect there?
Yeah, it maps pretty directly, actually. His whole analysis about deepening polarization, well, that clearly pushes against the goal of forming a more perfect union.
Right.
And his strong defense of free expression is obviously an argument for preserving the blessings of liberty. It's interesting because while he fully supports the need to establish justice, he constantly questions whether the methods being used right now actually achieve that without undermining those other crucial constitutional aims.
He even seems to suggest that some of these rapid ideological shifts, even if intended as progress, might actually be fueling instability, working against ensuring domestic tranquility. It feels like a critique of the means, maybe not always the ends.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that his focus doesn't really feel like just scoring partisan points. It seems more like a genuine concern for the structural health of liberal democracy itself. He's using the Constitution's ideals as a kind of yardstick to measure where we are now in terms of discourse.
This seems like a natural place to pause for a quick moment before we dig into the ethics and the logic of his argument itself.
Sounds good. Mindful Moments, which is our YouTube channel, offers AI, book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts, all designed to inspire reflection and hopefully rational thought.
Welcome back. Let's pick up with the ethical dimension. Thinking about the golden rule of, treat others as you'd want to be treated, how does Williams navigate critiquing both sides while trying to maintain, as you said, this floor of universal dignity?
Yeah, he's actually quite fierce about advocating for that universal floor of dignity for everyone. He explicitly supports standard liberal goals, things like expanding access to health care and education, regardless of identity group. So that foundation suggests a kind of ethical reciprocity, right? He's aiming to treat others based on shared humanity.
And he applies that standard pretty rigorously when he critiques what he sees as illiberal excesses, whether they come from the left or the right.
Precisely. And this is where he asks some really uncomfortable questions. Like, if the stated goal of activism is to help the least advantaged, well, are the current forms of ideological activism and the resulting policy shifts actually benefiting those people? Or, he asks, are these very rigid approaches just creating new kinds of division or maybe suppression, or even impacting people's careers? The analysis suggests the book tries to perform this kind of mental role reversal, asking us to distinguish between addressing genuine historical harms and potentially generating new damaging dynamics right now.
That leads us perfectly into the logical analysis. How does the argument hold up just in terms of its internal reasoning? What are the logical strengths of Summer of Our Discontent?
Well, I think a major strength is the overall consistency of its tone and its rigor. The book mostly avoids those easy logical traps, like attacking the person instead of the argument ad hominem or misrepresenting opposing views, straw man arguments.
Okay.
Instead, Williams generally maintains this kind of self-critical, questioning approach. His logic feels strongest, clearest, when he's methodically tracing that cycle of ideological backlash he described, and also when he's documenting the decline of certain classical liberal ideals in places like academia or the media. That part feels well supported.
But, as with most arguments, critics in our framework did find some potential logical weaknesses. Where does the reasoning maybe falter a bit?
Yeah, some reviewers definitely found the analysis a bit uneven. There are points where the arguments seem to rely quite heavily on examples that have become, standard talking points in the culture wars. The same few examples get brought up a lot.
The usual suspect.
Kind of. And maybe moments where he doesn't fully contextualize really complex issues, like the deep history of racial inequality in the U.S. that goes way beyond just the 2020 events.
And you mentioned earlier that potential for circularity in his main diagnosis. That can be tricky when you're writing about discourse itself.
Yes, exactly. There's a risk there. The diagnosis can sometimes feel a bit circular. Is ideological polarization the cause of the crisis, or is it the symptom, or
Right.
both? If polarization drives certainty, and certainty then drives more polarization, it makes it kind of hard for the reader to see where you'd even start to intervene or try to change things systemically.
That complexity brings us to our final assessment, the wisdom assessment. Thinking about the long term. What are the consequences Williams seems most worried about if these trends just continue?
Oh, he's definitely concerned about the long game. The consequences he sketches out aren't small things. He talks about the entrenchment of really illiberal norms, ongoing, maybe even permanent civic division, and ultimately the loss of open-minded, pluralistic conversation in public life.
A pretty grim outlook.
Yeah, he warns that there could be lasting harm to our democratic institutions if these current trends of absolute certainty and antagonism just keep going.
But he doesn't just leave it there, right? He ends with a kind of call for renewal, focused on intellectual virtues.
He does. The whole book, in a way, feels like an implicit plea for more nuance, more humility, more pluralism. He basically suggests these are essential prerequisites if we want any kind of social or economic flourishing in America. His warning is pretty stark. If we can't figure out how to disagree better, we're probably not going to be able to solve our really big problems.
So let's try to offer a balanced conclusion on Summer of Our Discontent. On the one hand, it's clearly a sharply written book, remarkably self-aware in many places, and it engages very earnestly with its difficult topic. It definitely refuses to just settle for easy answers or platitudes.
Absolutely. And I think it succeeds really well in weaving that personal memoir element with the broader philosophical analysis. It sort of models the intellectual openness it's arguing for. Williams makes a really compelling and I think important case for defending core liberal values like freedom of expression against these new kinds of rigid orthodoxies popping up across the political map.
On the other hand, though, we do have to acknowledge the limitations. Sometimes the analysis maybe relies a bit too much on those familiar anti-woke arguments, which might slightly lessen the fresh insight in favor of making a stronger polemical point.
Right.
And a few chapters perhaps lack really detailed practical solutions for how to actually implement the kind of reforms he seems to be advocating for.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with some pretty critical unresolved questions to think about. Based on his analysis, is genuine civic unity even possible anymore, given how entrenched these ideological divides seem?
That's a big one.
And maybe even tougher. How can we possibly foster nuance and humility systemically? How do you do that in a culture that seems to increasingly reward performance, certainty, and just viral antagonism online and elsewhere?
Those are definitely questions to chew on. Now, if you want to explore alternative perspectives, especially on race in America, we definitely recommend looking at the writings of Ta-Nehisi Coates for a significant counterpoint.
Yeah, and for a deeper dive into defending liberal pluralism specifically, Yascha Mounk's work is very relevant. And of course, for the philosophical underpinnings of the kind of critical thinking framework we used here, Mortimer J. Adler's writings on epistemology and civic virtue are foundational.
It's worth noting that this specific analysis was generated using a rigorous, systematic framework. It's designed specifically to map arguments, evaluate ethical consistency, and assess the potential long-term wisdom of a text against core civic principles.
Okay.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and please think rationally.
And check out the many other genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.